Good morning, and thank you for joining us at the Soufan Center this morning. We're delighted to host this virtual event today and hope soon we can meet in person. Our discussion today will focus on the risks posed by white supremacist groups and disinformation, their implications for law enforcement and security. My name is Naureen Chowdhury Fink, and I'm the Executive Director at the Soufan Center. Based in New York City, the Soufan Center is a nonpartisan center dedicated to research, analysis, and dialogue with a focus on global security issues and the rule of law. A quick note on terminology before we kick off today's exciting discussion. As a center, we have used the term white supremacy extremism as an umbrella term to cover the different threads and factions within this broader movement. One of the challenges in combating this movement is that, as in many other social movements, it is not monolithic. And as we saw at the Capitol on the 6th, it brings together many groups and objectives. We also recognize, very importantly, that membership in these groups in and of itself is not illegal in the United States. However, our key concerns remain the incitement to commit violence and the prospect of widespread violence that compromises the democratic process. So please bear in mind throughout the conversations today that you will hear terms like far-right extremism, extreme right, violent white supremacy. We also have an exciting update for our program today. In part one of our discussion, we will now host a fireside chat between Representative Elissa Slotkin and Ali Soufan. Representative Elissa Slotkin serves Michigan's 8th Congressional District. Representative Slotkin has spent her career in national service. After the 9/11 attacks, she knew that national service would define her career. She was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to be a Middle East analyst and went on to devote a career to protecting the United States from national security threats. Ali Soufan is a former FBI agent and a leading national security expert and counterterrorism specialist. He is the founder of the Soufan Center and CEO of the Soufan Group. In part two of today's discussion, we will be joined by Jason Blazakis and Patrick Skinner. Very briefly, Jason Blazakis is a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center. Jason directs the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at the Middlebury Institute, where he is also a professor. He was previously with the US federal government for nearly 20 years, with more than 10 years of that time spent in the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department. Patrick Skinner is a police officer in Savannah, Georgia, and will be joining us as a TSC contributor and also where he works on special projects at the Soufan Group. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping issues. This conversation is on the record and will be available later on our website and in social media. On questions and answers, we'd like to thank those of you who submitted questions via email, and we will try and address a selection of those questions in our discussions. Once again, we're delighted you could join us this morning. And with that, I present Representative Elissa Slotkin and Ali Soufan. Ali, you have the floor.
Thank you, Naureen. What an honor to be with you today and to be with Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin. Elissa, as everybody heard, she has been fighting for the national security of the United States and to protect the American people for a long period of time, and she continued to carry that mantle as a Congresswoman on the Hill today. Elissa, welcome to our webinar. It's great to have you. And one of my first questions is, everybody in the world, everybody in the nation, we're grappling with the political implication of this attack. And we're here to talk about the short-term and the long-term security consequences. But first, I have to ask you, in that moment of the attack, in that moment of the strike on the heart of our democracy, you were in the room. What was your personal reaction?
Well, I mean, I was actually walking to the Capitol and was just below the floor of the House of Representatives. There was a one-flight staircase that we usually take up to go right to the floor of the House. And I probably put my first or second, step in there when I heard yelling and screaming and breaking of glass, what I thought was a flashbang, which probably ended up being a gunshot based on where I was and at what time. And I immediately clicked into a very different mode of my life. I did 3 tours with the CIA alongside the military. The brain just starts running kind of get off the X, get off the X, get off the bullseye or the target. And I kind of hauled ass back to my office and spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with the senior ranks of the Pentagon, trying to get them to send the National Guard out, and wanting them to hear from someone who had, seen dangerous situations before, just putting it on the record that we had lost control of the situation. So obviously that's the physical reaction, but obviously, in the days afterwards, and even that night, the reaction of my constituents back in Michigan, just everyone I knew, people from abroad, people from DC, the symbolism of the People's House was being sort of looted in a way. I think was just traumatic for a lot of people, and I think sadly, I knew there was going to be violence that day because I'm from Michigan and we've been dealing with this problem, frankly, since about April when folks came into our capital armed, and we've been having some armed protests, some violent threats against our governor emanating out of my district for many, many months now. So I had told my staff, do not come to work. I don't want any staff in work, but I thought it would be outside. I thought we would have violence on the mall or on the Capitol grounds. I didn't expect things to happen inside. And I think what the record will probably show is that we deeply underestimated the threat. And I think there's a lot in that, right? There's a lot of reasons why we may have underestimated that threat. But walking to work today, it is clear we are not taking anything for granted. And it is really, truly a secure zone around the Capitol.
Wow. I just cannot imagine that you as a CIA had to analyze these kind of situations for foreign countries, but did you ever expect to see it here at home in the United States, in the People's House?
Yeah, obviously, certainly not inside. I think, for me, I had prepared remarks that night because we were expecting that there would be opposition to the certification of the vote in Michigan, right? So the Michigan Democratic delegation had prepared our rebuttal. And in that rebuttal, before the attack, I had written that I think, we are seeing the end of the post 9/11 era, the 20 years where folks like us here were focused externally on groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and radicalization from abroad that threatens Americans from outside. And we were really seeing the beginning of a very new era where the greatest threat to national security for the average American is the division between us as Americans. I wrote that before the attack, and certainly the symbolism of the attack kind of, for me, sort of put a bow on that. And just like I was in New York on 9/11, and that changed my orientation, I think being here on the 6th of January likewise changed my orientation. And I'm bringing a lot of the skills, as you all are, of looking at radicalization, looking at how propaganda is used to mobilize people. But now I'm looking at it in groups that are using violence here in the United States. I never in my life thought I'd be doing that.
Yeah, indeed. So based on your experience and based what you're seeing today as a member of Congress, especially as a member of Congress representing the great state of Michigan, how do you see the short-term implication and the long-term implication of such a threat? Because I think I cannot find anyone better than you to ask this question, because that's what you did for a living after 9/11.
So I think obviously we have a near-term issue of just getting through this week, getting through tomorrow, kind of letting temperatures come down, having the transition of power, that sort of deeply, deeply symbolic and important event, which I think will be important. But then we have a longer term issue. And I got to tell you, while everyone else went home to their districts and was spending time with loved ones, I spent the weekend in the Police Operations Center in Lansing, Michigan, in my district, because we had armed protests again this past Sunday in front of our Capitol. Now, luckily, it was much smaller, but what it reveals is that this is not over, right? This is not going to end because Biden is now the president. I think we need to understand that we need a plan of how we deal with this threat inside the United States. People have the right to free speech. That's a very different idea than how we dealt with external threats. And it's much dicier and more confusing to figure out what the right approach is. But your rights to free speech end when you threaten violence. The truth is we need a sort of robust approach looking at our legal structure, looking at propaganda and the role of mobilizing people, and then also how we take people who are bent on violence and sort of deprogram and say, this isn't the right way. We've been trying to do this, or other countries have certainly been trying to do this for years with terrorists. So a lot of the lessons that we've been learning are unfortunately going to have to be adapted for a much more complex legal environment. And I know I'm on the Homeland Security Committee and on the Terrorism Subcommittee, and this is going to be the bulk of our work for the next year.
I think you mentioned something early on that we underestimated that threat, and after the smoke settled, we're going to realize that we should have been more serious about it. Many people in the U.S., including the folks in our center, have been warning for years about how these groups are developing inside the United States. You mentioned the Homeland Security Committee. I testified in front of Chairman Thompson and the entire committee, and even after that, wrote an op-ed with Max Rose regarding this threat. But unfortunately, we still did not see any action from the government to at least acknowledge the threat that we're facing domestically. Also, as you know, and that's more your expertise, international, this threat is now transnational. And a lot of these groups are connected to other groups in other Western countries, to include Germany, Norway, Ukraine, England, Canada, and so forth. How do you see us moving forward in dealing with this threat from a domestic perspective and from a transnational perspective?
Yeah, well, first of all, government intent is very important, right? I mean, we were unable to get real movement out of the Trump administration on many of these things, even when the FBI would come and talk to us about how they needed additional support, additional authorities. They would want to, in many cases, in the rank and file, deal with this issue, but at the senior most levels, it was not something that was of interest because of this perceived overlap between some of these groups and some groups that had supported the president. I think you're seeing the appointment of people who I have known for a long time, who have been working in this space for a long time, and who are taking this threat. Of course, if they weren't taking it seriously before the 6th of January, they certainly are taking it seriously now. So we'll have a more collaborative approach. But then we also have to realize, and this is for folks who are just watching at home, I'm kind of like came of age professionally in the 9/11 era. And, the folks who were working like the hot accounts were all working Al-Qaeda and then ISIS. They were working the external threats. And domestic terrorism was kind of a backwater for many of these places, many of our national security agencies. And we need to, completely change that. If you're a young person and you're looking to make your mark in the national security world, we need bright, passionate, committed people working on domestic terrorism, lawyers who work on this and who specialize in this. We need this field to be attracting the talent that, frankly, external terrorism, foreign terrorism had taken before. And then, but obviously the links to foreign terrorists, it's kind of amazing. I think it's something that's not well understood, that there are these sort of right-wing, white supremacist international groups that operate, and the chatter between them is not insignificant. So that's a tool we've used a lot in foreign terrorism, right? If you are an American, but you're chatting it up with an ISIS leader, that gives us a lot more of an opportunity to come and check out what's happening. Same thing should go for these white supremacist groups. If you're having robust conversations with foreign groups, we should look at that just like we've done with a few groups now of listing them as foreign terrorist organizations. It's not just folks emanating out of the Middle East. that are terrorists. If you're using violence, you're a terrorist and you should be designated as so.
That's a very good question. And we worked very closely with Congress and with even the Trump administration in trying to designate some of these groups, or at least raise awareness about some of these groups as international terrorist organizations. Frankly, in the national security strategy by President Trump, they recognized neo-Nazi groups, and even they named some groups like the one in Europe, the name escaped me, I'm sorry. A couple of organizations in Europe as a threat to the national security of the United States. Also, we worked very closely with the State Department in designating RIM, the Russian Imperial Movement, the very first time ever a white supremacist organization is designated, specially designated as a terrorist organization by State Department. But unfortunately, we didn't see any efforts by DOJ or by prosecutors in actually going after supporters of these organizations or chapters of these organizations in the United States, the way we've seen them go after Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Hamas or Taliban or any of the groups that designated or specially designated by the US government. What kind of lesson learned from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and knowing a lot about these lessons, we can apply to counter this so-called domestic terrorism threat, especially that we know many of our allies around the world, to include Five Eyes allies like England, for example, and Canada, have designated some of these groups as terrorist organizations, yet they still have chapters in the United States, and it seems that we're not going after them like our allies are going after them. We're not following up with this designation. What kind of lesson learned we can apply, especially from the early stage of fighting Al-Qaeda in targeting the threat here at home?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's intent. So if you think about, after the Oklahoma City bombing, back in the 90s, Timothy McVeigh, this horrific attack, there was a preschool underneath the government federal building. You had children who were killed. The American mind sort of woke up to this idea of domestic terrorism. But then the next attack we had was from Al-Qaeda. We had both in the, in the 90s, but then the real attack in 2001 drew our attention in a way that we hadn't been focused on foreign terrorism. Very few people were focused on, sort of foreign terrorism in that way. So first of all, it's intent, focus, support, money. And I think people have certainly woken up to that. I think also it's just a rigor to the work. We actually have quite a number of laws on the books, certainly in states. I know like Michigan, we have some of the strongest domestic terrorism laws in the country. We just don't exercise them that much. And it's not until a horrible thing like an attempt to kidnap and assassinate my governor that we start focusing on it. So I think we're there. And just like we were sort of right after 2001, there was this surge of trying to figure out what we can do and how to put some energy into this effort. But I also think we have to learn the lessons of what didn't go particularly well in the last 20 years. I mean, you can't arrest your way out of this problem. You can't bomb your way out of this problem, certainly in the United States. You can't sort of hammer your way through. It has to be a whole of government effort, a whole of society effort. And number one, the propaganda, right? How are people being radicalized? They're getting fed this information, and we're struggling with that right now as a country because we do have freedom of speech. So how do we get our hands around the propaganda? And then how do we make sure we understand why people are doing what they're doing, what their motivation is? Are they disconnected? Are they disaffected? Why is it that they feel the desire to do this? If we don't understand in a whole of government way how to educate people, we're going to be in trouble, which is why something like Holocaust education, fits into countering violent extremism in the United States. If you don't understand sort of the symbols and the stories of the Holocaust, you're more prone to be swept in and pulled in by some of these anti-Semitic groups, right? With the conspiracy theories. So it takes a comprehensive effort. And I think the Biden administration is poised to treat it as such.
You mentioned something extremely important about the propaganda, and most of that propaganda is based on disinformation. And clearly disinformation is a major drive or a driver in the attack that we witnessed on the US Capitol on January 6th. So what should we do about the emerging terrorism disinformation nexus? I'm trying to unpack your statement about the freedom of speech and all the protections that we have in the United States. It makes it a little bit more complicated to deal with conspiratorial disinformation lies that's feeding and giving wind into these groups.
Right. Well, listen, it's clear that the social media companies have largely been dragging their feet. They don't have a consistent policy. I come from Michigan, where we have the car industry, right? Lots of engineers, lots of people who want to sell lots of great things, but there are standards, there are safety organizations, there is intellectual thought that goes into, as an industry, how to keep people safe. We don't have that with social media. They've resisted that. They've underinvested in that. So that's got to change. And we see that when they want to shut things down, they can shut things down. So it's not, I'm not feeling like we've gotten the most out of our social media companies. But also, we need to, look at taking some of the rules that guide what you can put on TV and radio and thinking about that for social media. You can't just get on television and spew complete lies and not be subject at some point to some sort of lawsuit. But on social media, there's literally no accountability. So I think making sure we adapt our laws to social media. And then honestly, I think frankly, if the social media companies are not interested, the servers, we've seen how important it is to go after the companies that host these sites, right? That's why Parler is no longer being hosted by AWS. Apparently they're being hosted by a Russian Federation-based group. We can debate whether that's a good or bad thing, but the servers, there are different links in this chain to target disinformation, especially violence promotion. So that's all the kind of stuff I know that we're going to be taking on in the Homeland Security Committee.
Well, it's always, so fascinating talking to a congresswoman like yourself, who have a lot of national security experience and fought for the safety and the security of this nation for a long time and put her life on the line many times, and continue to put her life on the line, as what happened on January 6th, for the sake of this democracy and for this republic. What kind of advice somebody like you can give people like us, people from the outside? You mentioned that it is a whole society approach. What kind of advice you can give us, and also what kind of advice you will give a person in your expertise and experience, the incoming Biden administration, on how to tackle these domestic threats? And also, we cannot forget about the international threats that we're dealing with.
Yeah, no, we can't forget about the international threats. We can't take our eye off the ball. But I do think, for folks who have been looking particularly at foreign terrorism, really consolidating the lessons learned from the past 20 years, so that all the people, all the journalists, all the lawmakers, all the average people who are now super interested in domestic terrorism and extremism aren't kind of flailing around. They have some frame of reference to how to think about these things. People, I think this is new. It's just new to them. It's not new. So organizations like the Soufan Center can, I think, really help create a lot of easy, readable lessons learned documents to put out. And some of those lessons were learned because we did things the wrong way, big time. So acknowledging that, but putting those into somewhere concise. But then also, I think it's important that we realize that the tension between us here as Americans is a real threat, but it can't be handled simply by taking all of our frame of reference on Al-Qaeda and ISIS and putting it onto our fellow Americans. We are all in this country together. We have one destiny. And if we don't figure out how to work through our differences without violence, there's not going to be a role for our democracy. So I think there's a lot of soft power, softer conversations that need to be having between Americans. I'm a big believer in 18 months of national service, right? So that Americans get to know each other from different parts of the country, different groups, different, experiences. We need to also think about our role in society of not just talking about this stuff, but doing things that connect us to different Americans. And we all have that responsibility, no matter who we are. And that's what I want to do, certainly from my role as a Congresswoman.
Well, it is an honor to have you with us today. Thank you very much. And we really appreciate everything you did for our country, everything you continue to do. And I hope that this event is the first of many other events, with the Soufan Center. And hopefully you can keep helping us and help educate the public about the threats that we are facing today. It was a great honor to chat with you, Congresswoman.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for all the work you all do.
Thank you. Thank you. And as we end today, I would like to announce that our team at the Soufan Center will soon release a new digital resource for mapping of the insurrection, including a resource library of white supremacy extremism. Please look out for this new product coming soon, and you can find it on the SoufanCenter.org on our website. And with that, I thank you all for joining us, and we will be right back with part 2 of this event shortly. Thank you very much.
Welcome to session 2, everyone, and thanks to those of you who've been joining us from the very beginning. In fact, it was such a rich discussion. I'm not sure I can read my own notes for this panel, but I am delighted to be joined by Jason and Patrick. So let's get right to it and continue the discussion. After the shocking scenes of insurrection, which unfolded on January 6th, and maybe even more so as the reports and reflections kind of came out afterward, one of the key questions that I think has continued to shock everybody is the law enforcement failure. And this is not in any way to denigrate the individuals who did their job with honor and who did the best with what was available. You know, we know that Brian Sicknick paid the ultimate price for doing his job. And from all reports, Eugene Goodman and his quick thinking on his feet averted even worse scenes. But it can't really be denied there was a failure of leadership, and those who were left there were sort of woefully under-supported and exposed. And this is despite widespread predictions from law enforcement, from experts, from the Soufan Center and our own team about the potential for violence. So we will be here to talk about what went wrong. What could we have done better? Patrick, I'm going to turn to you first. You've had some experience with the Capitol Police, and you've written for the Soufan Center on what should have been done to protect the Capitol. Given the tremendous investments we've seen recently in resourcing the Capitol Police, clearly some people did think they might be confronted with such scenes. What surprised you the most, and what do you think was the greatest failure that you saw?
I think, frankly, the greatest failure was to listen to the people that said they were going to fight you. One of the most important things to do in a fight, literally a personal fight, but also in a security struggle, is to understand when you're in a fight. When someone says they're going to punch you in the face, you probably should listen to them. And so individuals were saying that online, like, I am coming to the Capitol with my gun. Now, granted, despite people's perception, we're not vacuuming up every bit of signals, intelligence, and focusing, but this was not that. This was promoted by the President of the United States. It was promoted by senators, by entire cable companies, and and then on social media. I'm not even talking social media. I'm talking the President, the White House, Congress, everything. And they were saying, come take your country back. And so the failure was that the Capitol Police, which I was Capitol Police right before and then the year after 9/11, where it changed. The job went from just like a nice little job because I lived on Capitol Hill to protection, like what you thought would have happened on January 6th. And so from all reports, it was a complete failure. And I'm very sympathetic because I understand the political dynamics of the Capitol Police. It's not like anywhere else. It's beholden to the Congress, the Senate and House Sergeant at Arms are in charge of security, but they answer to the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader. In fact, they answer to everybody, all 538 members of Congress. And so, all they care about is optics. They care about the constituents and their issues, but they also care about optics. And so they don't want to say that the seat of democracy is now an armed camp. Well, and I get that. In fact, now the reports are coming out, that's exactly what they wanted to avoid. But it became a sacked capital, like something we would read about the Visigoths in Rome. And I'm so glad I remember the word Visigoth. But the failure was you let too many people get physically close to the building. There should have been substantial barriers. I mean, forget all the high-tech stuff. How about fencing instead of snow fences? I mean, little things like that, keep people back. And everybody should have been on duty. They from some reports, didn't have enough staffing. Now, they were never going to have enough staffing. Even if you had 2,000 people, that's not enough because conservatively, there would have been 50,000 people that were going to walk. And again, they kept telling us they were going to do it. I don't talk in the media much anymore, but I gave an interview 2 days before that where I said they are going to do this. And it wasn't because I was smart. It was because I took them for their word. And so I think we always think these terrorists look different or that they are different. And the failure was that we didn't take the people at their word. And physical security was lacking. The Capitol is very hard to defend anyway. Once you get close to the building, there are a lot of windows, a lot of little nooks and crannies. It's not designed as a fort. It's literally not. That's why it's called a Capitol. And so that's the first thing was they didn't realize they didn't believe what was about to happen.
Patrick, then do you see that, I mean, given the scale of what you're talking about, do you see that as negligence, or do you believe there was a greater degree of complicity? And of course, the second one is even more frightening in a way, right? But it really beggars belief that they would be so exposed. And so negligence, complicity, somewhere in between?
Well, it's definitely negligence. I mean, I don't subscribe intentions to people's actions. I usually just look at the results, and the results are a bunch of people who overran the U.S. Capitol. So that's negligence right there. Were there individual officers or people that had sympathetic? Sure, of course. And again, that's because, and hopefully we'll talk about it in a second, we somehow normalized this action. We normalized this thought, this rhetoric that people should, it is normal for us to stand around a state capitol and then the U.S. Capitol with armed guns threatening murder. And so we should have, yes, it was negligence. Are some people complicit in the fact that they sided with that? Maybe, I have no idea. But once you broke down security into these individuals, and I wrote in the Washington Post, if your security plan rests on the heroism of your individual officers, you haven't written a security plan. You've written a suicide note for all those officers, and it killed one of them, and it killed some protesters. And so, is it complicity? I don't know. That's probably not going to be a real factor. I think that when the studies come out of the research with the commission, hopefully, it's going to show that we were negligent because we always are with these kind of threats.
Thanks, Patrick. Jason, many people looking at the footage at home and abroad have expressed shock that 20 years after 9/11 and a staggering investment by all counts in countering terrorism, a crowd could so easily storm the building and imperil not only the lives of lawmakers and staff, but really the fundamental linchpin of the democratic process. And as Patrick was saying, just that physical ability to get that close to the building. How do you think this will impact counterterrorism going forward, and planning for things like continuity of government in the face of crisis? Patrick has said we've normalized some of these actions. Do we even think of it as counterterrorism? So over to you to think about impacts on counterterrorism planning.
Thanks, Naureen. And it's really early in California, so the sun is now basking on me. People are like, what's going on here? So I apologize for that. I'll just say, as a former congressional staffer, the events of January 6th were really difficult for me to watch. I was on Capitol Hill in the Cannon House office building in 1998 when we suffered another attack. Officers Chestnut and Gibson were killed in an attack carried out by an individual who probably had anti-government extremists. So it really hit me close to home. And I used to be in the executive branch too. And we thought about two things quite often in the context of the executive branch. You mentioned one, continuity of government, COG. And then the other is continuity of operation plans, COOP. And as I was watching the coverage, I was thinking to myself, I'm not sure we have COG or COOP plans to handle situations in which we have a significant domestic uprising that is being incited by the commander-in-chief, who these COG and COOP plans are designed around in many ways, right? So I think we really have to dust off some of these COOP and COG plans to reflect on the internal situation in this really high internal threat that we're facing first and foremost. Another point I want to make, and I think this is really important, is that we have to guard against the possibility of government overreaction too. Unlike the Trump administration, I do think we have to do something, right? I think objectively, any rational observer is going to tell you that the Trump team essentially ignored the threat of domestic terrorism. But I do think Congress and the incoming Biden team should consider something along the lines of a domestic terrorism law, for instance. And I think it needs to be narrowly focused, that essentially allows for the US government to charge individuals who are carrying out actual acts of violence that meet the FBI's definition of terrorism pursuant to 18 US code. And we can't have a domestic terrorism law, for instance, that overreaches and jeopardizes freedom of speech and in assembly. The second, I think, thing we need to do, and Patrick covered this, is it was pretty clear that the Capitol building needs to be better secured, right? But that said, it is the people's building. You know, Ali Soufan, Representative Slotkin mentioned the people's building a number of times in their conversations earlier today. We can't have it fortified for the duration of time like an embassy overseas. You know, I worked in Afghanistan in 2004, and quite frankly, in 2004, going to my office in Embassy Kabul was easier than when I'm talking to my friends in DC, getting to their homes and going through concentric circles of checkpoints. This needs to be a temporary thing, but we need to think creatively about how we can better fortify the capital in the future. And then the third thing I'll say is this is an internal threat as well, right? We're looking at the people who were involved in the protests. We saw that there was law enforcement involved in the protests that turned into a riot. We saw the Oath Keepers and 3%ers, active reservists, National Guard members, all part of that protest. And we saw reports from the FBI saying, you know, they're really concerned about the internal threat to the inauguration, perhaps more so than an external threat. And from my perspective, we have to start thinking about how we look at our SF-86 forms in the security clearance process to try to think more creatively about who individuals are that are in our midst who may be susceptible or part of sort of this white supremacy extremist movement that is happening before our eyes. And then we have to also think about empowering the various criminal investigative services within, say, the Air Force, like the Office of Special Investigations and NCIS within the Navy, because they are really under-resourced as well. And I think they have a role to play in uncovering which individuals within active duty or the National Guard or reservists who may be part of the Oath Keepers or 3%ers, those who pose such a profound threat. So these are a couple of the things I would do, Naureen, off top.
Thanks, Jason, and really appreciate that. I think we'll need a whole other webinar to unpack many of the things you and Patrick have already mentioned, but I still have a few more questions, so maybe we will need a few more blockbuster sequels. But, you know, so much of what you've both spoken about focuses, of course, on the domestic implications, you know, the threat to the Capitol, the importance of freedom of speech and domestic legislative measures. But, you know, as Ali and Representative Slotkin were also mentioning earlier, we know that the chaos could have created opportunities for malign actors, and we know that the vulnerabilities that have been exposed could also have longer term implications. You know, it blows my mind that we are talking about Parler being hosted, you know, in Russia and things like that, and that, you know, people were stealing laptops. Patrick, what do you think were some of the key risks about, you know, foreign exploitation or malign actors, given everything we saw at the Capitol?
I'm sure that they try to exploit it. They probably try to fuel it, but we're. I think right now we're running away with it. We don't really need a lot of foreign incitement right now. There was clearly a campaign by Russia leading up to 2016. But we've kind of taken over. We're doing it for them. Any intelligence service worth their salt certainly is interested in what happened, and they're trying to figure out how that helps them. Now, most of the countries, it doesn't help them, thankfully. You know, like Five Eyes and those governments, they're not really trying to exploit the situation. But Russia, China, non-state actors even, which I think is a big deal because that's the bridge between national intent and capability and then what's happening physically on the ground. They're not sending spies in, they're just getting useful idiots here, and we have a bumper crop of them right now. But yeah, it's not so much that they're stealing FI or foreign intelligence or stuff that's of real value. I mean, that might have happened. SCIFs I don't think any SCIFs were broken. They tend not to be in those buildings or in the House and Senate buildings on the side. I think the bigger issue is that it happened in the first place. That's the FI win. That's the foreign intelligence win, is that the United States, who, God, we won't stop bragging about being the world's greatest democracy, just had an insurrection on January 6th.
Right.
And then now we're like, well, that was uncomfortable. And so that's the foreign intelligence win. It is hard to overstate how devastating this is. It makes it harder for the CIA and other people to recruit spies to say, hey, work for us, because we're not perfect, but we try to be better, when clearly we're not doing that right now. It makes it harder on the ground everywhere. Every time we trash other countries, every time we run our mouth, it makes the intelligence job harder, it makes security job. And who's going to trust us if we don't trust ourselves?
Thanks for flagging that, Patrick. I think, quite often we forget about that connection between soft power and hard power. And as you say, just the soft power damage and the damage to that, beacon on the hill that has dimmed a little after January 6th. I don't know how, even in the space of 4 years, with all the work that is planned, we'll be able to overcome that. But that connection between soft power and hard power is something really critical, I think. And thanks for highlighting that. Patrick, did you want to come, Jason, did you want to come in with any thoughts on when you think we might have a better idea if any materials were compromised on that day and what risks we can pose? If you have any thoughts on that question.
Sure, thanks, Naureen. I'll just say, as I was watching the footage live, the really disturbing footage, one of the first scenes I saw was of an individual in Representative Pelosi's office. We remember with his feet up on the desk. Later, we saw him with a piece of mail. But what I saw as I was watching that is, the floor passes for members of Congress were accessible right there next to him, that provide access to the House floor. So I really was worrying about sort of how could key documents and badges be exploited? How could it be compromised? And I see that as a short-term challenge, right? That's one that can be rectified pretty quickly by the creation of new documents and badges. The second I was really worried about was the compromise of congressional IT equipment, things like computers, laptops, those that weren't removed, did they have malware inserted into them? And we saw reports, I think yesterday, of course, that this one individual had the desire to possibly sell Representative Pelosi's laptop to the SVR. That was really disturbing to hear. The third thing I'd be worried about is the issue of physical space. And when an office has been essentially perforated, like we saw on the 6th, I would be thinking about, and I'm sure this is happening, wanding those offices, checking for bugs, ensuring that those offices, haven't had listening devices in place within them. And then fourth, I would say, there were a number of unmarked congressional offices that we know now that members go to deliberate. They don't have their name on the door. And those were actually also violated by the insurrectionists. So I imagine, those offices are being moved. If somebody has an office in the Cannon House office building that's unmarked, hopefully they're putting them somewhere else, Longworth or Rayburn. So, for me, as I was thinking about these things, I was thinking about these physical, these IT issues, these document-related issues related to the insurrection. And I know full well security professionals are thinking about them, but I also have in the back of my mind that the foreign intelligence services that Patrick had mentioned, who are trying to sow distrust in American discord, they wouldn't be doing their jobs also if they didn't try to take advantage of the insurrection. Now, we don't have any reports that they did, but I do have that in the back of my mind, and I do worry of that possibility as well. So those were some of the things, Naureen, I was thinking about as I was observing the events on the 6th.
Thanks, Jason. And of course, in some ways, this feels like it's already been a lifetime since January 6th as we're dealing with the shock, but it has actually just been a short amount of time, and we're still grappling with these unknown unknowns, which I think is part of the concern. But I hope we will have a bit of clarity soon about where some of these things can be plugged for next time. You mentioned the word trust, and I think one of the things that really struck me, and I'm sure many others, beyond the immediate crises, is that the failures of security on January 6th will have damaged trust in many ways, within the forces and the leadership, between the public and the security forces. And in some ways, it'll be interesting to see what trust between these sort of white supremacist conspiracy theorist groups and anti-government groups, they may have trusted the law enforcement to be on their side. And they may have, their narrative was also premised on a kind of trust with security forces. In terms of trust between the public and the forces and between the forces and their leadership, how do we go about addressing this trust deficit? And I think will be interesting to hear how both of you think that the narrative of these groups might change after seeing that they're not being supported en masse by police. We heard really brave words by officers who were there that, they would do it again for free, that they saw their job as really protecting the Constitution. And to my mind, that will have perhaps some really interesting repercussions on the narrative we see over the coming days. Now, we still have about 5-6 minutes, so I'd love to turn over first to Patrick and then come back to Jason on your thoughts on bridging this trust deficit.
Yeah, I think the trust is going to be, you have to look at it at a bunch of different levels. There is probably a big trust issue between the Capitol Police officers and their leadership. The new 2 acting leaders are now my former classmates. And so that's a trust issue right there. So each organization that failed, I mean, so powerfully failed, and just not just their mission, but failed their personnel, that trust is hurt. And I mean, you're going to join the Capitol Police right now? Probably not. Are you feeling like maybe you should leave the Capitol Police? Maybe, I don't know. But that has to be addressed. And hopefully they're doing that in-house. That is a private matter, but it's a public institution. Then there's a whole trust of the US government. Half the country wants to prove that the government is incompetent, okay? And I believe that the best way to regain trust is to be competent. We don't have to say anything, we just have to do it. You want to show that you're competent, don't let people over on the US Capitol with sticks. You want to be competent, you want to get back the trust, arrest the people that committed felonies, live streaming it on camera, and prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. Do people trust law enforcement? Is there an undeniable trend, or maybe a cancer, I guess is a better way, of racism, white supremacism, it looks like fascism between inside law enforcement and police? Yes, that is nothing new. That is as American as those institutions. In fact, some of it is in the roots of those institutions. I'm a police officer, I know this. To regain that trust is you have to do the right job every single day. And at the top of that, you just need the President of the United States to stop saying that it's okay to do that.
Thanks, Patrick. Jason?
So on the one side of the ledger, I would love to see more distrust of law enforcement and the military from QAnon and the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and 3%ers, because that means law enforcement and our military are upholding their duties and responsibilities. So I think in a lot of ways, that perceived trust that exists on the 6th, some of that is, I think, evaporating, because we did see a lot of brave law enforcement officers push back against that angry mob. And we need more of that throughout our local communities. We need people like Patrick Skinner, who is a cop in Savannah, who talks about these things, about gaining the trust of his community. You want the trust of the community, and you want that white supremacist next door to really not trust you, because then there's this feeling that they're on your side somehow and you're working together. The one thing I would really caution against is, and I do think there needs to be really serious investigations in the context of what happened on the 6th, especially as it pertains to potential insider challenges like I mentioned before. But the one thing I would really guard against is creating an atmosphere like we saw in the 1950s that McCarthy started with the FBI, where everybody is looking over their shoulder. That doesn't create trust. That just breeds more distrust. So I do worry about this overreaction that I mentioned before, where we're really tearing ourselves apart from within, because that's what a lot of our adversaries, again, that Patrick had talked about, really want, whether it's the Russian Federation, whether it's the Chinese government, or the Iranian government for that matter. So we need to be really careful about dealing with some of these insider threat issues, because if I'm a member of Congress, there are some people who were co-opted, it looked like. They were taking pictures with the rioters. If I'm a member, do I feel 100% safe right now? And I think the answer is I'm not sure. So how can that trust be rebuilt in a manner that doesn't lead to sort of these McCarthyite situations we saw in the 50s? That's going to be a really difficult needle to thread.
Yeah, if I could add something, it's that temptation to pass new laws is going to be almost irresistible, and I beg everybody not to do it. We don't need new laws. We don't. I mean, you might fine tune something and maybe work on some, but we need to enforce the laws we already have. It was already illegal to say I'm going to murder somebody. That's aggravated assault if I have the means to carry it out. It's already illegal to say I'm going to murder the governor of Michigan. It's already illegal to break down a fence and assault a police officer. And a lot of this stuff there is an ideological bent to a lot of it, okay? There is white supremacy ideology, sure, fascist ideology. And then you have this accelerationist where they just want to do violence. So you're not going to be really, there's no way to handle that with a tough guy approach. That's what they want. They want the tough guy approach, which we've done overseas a lot, and it obviously has failed. It was immoral, but it's also incredibly ineffective. And we do that here, except we call it the war on crime. And so now if we expand that war on crime to the war on whatever we're going to call it next, we are making a categorical and probably fatal mistake for our democracy. I just urge everybody, we just need to have we just need to stop electing people that say it's okay to kill people. I mean, everything else can start taking care of itself. The law enforcement can do a better job of policing themselves. The military, we need to do clear shame works. You know, if you're standing there doing white power signs in public, maybe don't stand, you know, maybe if you're a congressperson, you tell them not to do that, or you don't take poses with people that used to be in the KKK. But those are electoral problems. We keep electing these people, and calls for shame don't work on shameless people. Calls that you're asking them to resign, they're not going to resign. We need to have some kind of broader based movement where shame actually might work, but just a rejection. But we don't need that rejection in the form of more laws and law enforcement. That's going to create more problems. We just need to do our job. I investigate felonies every day, and I never said I need more laws or even more power. I just need to focus. That's what we're not focused on the right thing.
Jason, Patrick, instead of helping me wind down this webinar, it sounds like you've both restarted a whole new webinar, which could last the whole day. I think you've both highlighted some really key points. Before I close out, I did want to share one question because we've had a couple of emails about this. It's a big question, but I'll only give you guys 30 seconds. I'm sure you can manage. One of the common themes we're hearing and some of the feedback we're getting is what kind of signs should family members be concerned about if they're seeing signs? Now, we've heard this in the context of, radicalization and things like that before, and we've heard the cautions against this discussion, but people are writing in worried about when they need to seek external help for family members or friends or others exhibiting certain signs. So 30 seconds, Jason, 30 seconds, Patrick.
So the one thing is, the last panel talked about was conspiracies and disinformation. So if you have family members who are on Facebook, who are on Twitter, if they're following certain kinds of personalities or they're part of certain kinds of Facebook groups in where you're seeing conspiratorial laden information be shared, if you're seeing certain hashtags in which are associated with your family member, whether it's something that seems innocuous like Save the Children that's identifiable with QAnon to Stop the Steal, which is more problematic. I would try to have that conversation with them, try to engage with them. Family members and relatives know their family members and relatives really well, more so than outsiders. So try to have those difficult conversations if you see your family member following certain kinds of personalities online or using certain kind of language associated with disinformation campaigns associated with QAnon and others.
Okay. Patrick, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that if your family member or your friend or something like that is increasingly angry and they decide that guns are the way that they're going to protect themselves or to express themselves more specifically, if you have a family member who decides that they should open carry because they're afraid of their own government or that their freedom of expression involves a weapon, you probably want to do that. You just, have a conversation with them. The amount of guns, high-powered guns with people that are increasingly losing their grasp on reality is a problem. We see what's happening and we keep ignoring it.
Thanks, Jason and Patrick. And of course, I think I would add that if you do have very urgent concerns to contact, local or national law enforcement immediately if you need external help. I think that it's going to be impossible to wrap up everything that both of you have shared. We've talked about the domestic and international, as well as the kind of operational and political dimensions of this. So a huge thank you to both of you. I think for me, one of the key takeaways I'm coming away with about rebuilding trust and moving forward. And I think with Inauguration Day in sight, we would like to think about building better and moving forward is the three key words I was hearing was accountability, competence, an atmosphere, not creating an atmosphere of fear, and that hopefully with accountability, competence, and this more positive atmosphere, constructive atmosphere, we can start to rebuild some of that trust between the public, the government, law enforcement, and within them. But, we will hope for the best going forward. Thank you, Jason and Patrick, very much for joining us. I'm already looking forward to the second installment of this discussion. Thank you both, and thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. We look forward to it.
Thank you.